Thanks, Mary, and it was great to hear Craig and Ros and Sean before. Thanks for having me here. Hopefully, some of you won't have heard me give very similar presentations in the past on public ownership of energy generation in Scotland, or you might have heard me give a similar presentation about what's possible on a UK level. I'm speaking as Transition Economics, as Mary said, which is a small consultancy identifying solutions to get us to deliver a rapid and just transition. And we've done a lot of work for STUC in recent years, particularly around what that transition looks like, what a recovery from COVID can look like, and what's actually needed to create the green quality jobs that are necessary if we're going to have a just transition. And specifically in terms of electricity generation, as various previous speakers have mentioned, there actually is quite a lot of public ownership of offshore wind in Scotland. I haven't done up-to-date analysis whether it's just over 50% or just under 50%, but as we know, it's publicly owned by France or Sweden or Germany or Ireland. So for example, ENBW, which is the municipal provider for Baden-Württemberg. That's the region in the southwest of Germany that, for example, Stuttgart is in. So it's a municipal provider for a landlocked region, quite far from the sea. The population of Baden-Württemberg, I think, is about 11 million. They've won a lease in the recent ScotWind round alongside BP. A very large lease. Offshore wind is planned to be 2.9 gigawatts. So ENBW would effectively be getting 1.5 gigawatts from that. ENBW have also previously developed offshore wind farms off the north coast of Germany. The reason I highlighted them, as well as the fact that they're not one of the mega, they're not Ørsted. Ørsted, Denmark, small country, similar population to Scotland, but Ørsted is was the largest offshore wind company in the world. I think now, as Sean pointed out, with the acceleration in China, it's questionable whether they still are, but they're still, massive. ENBW are not like that. They're not mega in offshore wind. What's also interesting is that they were privatized. So it was a public company, then it was privatized, and it was private for quite a long time until it was brought back into public ownership, surprisingly by a conservative-run regional government. There was some dodginess about how that happened, but nonetheless, it's rebuilt as a significant portion of public ownership there. However, Scotland's experience of them coming in is not, they're not necessarily operating as, well, they definitely aren't operating as a democratic entity accountable to people in Scotland. Similarly, ESB, so the Inchcape offshore wind farm is being developed jointly between Red Rock and ESB. Red Rock is China state-owned entirely. ESB is the Irish public energy company, which runs the distribution grid across the island of Ireland. It also does supply, and it also does generation. And ESB's come into offshore wind relatively recently. They're not, plug in while I keep speaking. They're not one of the long-term players. They came in initially. They bought themselves a minor stake in an existing offshore wind farm. Then they participate in developing as a passive participant, but while development was happening. And then they also won recently one of the ScotWind contracts for a farm planned off the east coast of Shetland. And they're trying to now buy into two more planned farms off Harris that Northland Power won for 2.9 gigs. So they're expanding rapidly, and that also demonstrates the possibility for offshore wind, for publicly owned companies to grow in this space, even when they weren't previously there. It doesn't mean necessarily that foreign publicly owned companies will deliver the public benefits that we need to see in Scotland. The good analysis that Commonweal did the other week, looking at the supply chain plans from the companies who've won leases in ScotWind, showed that ESB came out worst, having less than 15% of supply chain spending within Scotland compared to all the others. So It's not automatically correlated. Hopefully, it would be possible to go to trade unions in Ireland and go, shouldn't you make ESB, push for ESB to be a bit better elsewhere? There is and has been some domestic public ownership of offshore wind in Scotland. The example that I tend to cite is this particular turbine at Leavenworth, which, as you can see, is offshore when the tide comes in and onshore when the tide comes out. It's a research turbine owned by Catapult, the offshore renewable energy Catapult. It's great, it's nice, it's good, it's used for research, for developing new offshore wind technology. The Catapult is obviously Catapults exist on a UK level, and they're very much run as a business-friendly entity. So it's not that it's democratically accountable. It's not about returning revenue to the public. It's nice that it's there. More interesting, I think, is this offshore wind farm. This is Aberdeen Bay, European Offshore Wind Development Centre. I think that's what they've called the wind farm. At one point, I think now it's often referred to as Aberdeen Bay. So this is now owned entirely by Vattenfall. When those wind turbines were put in, they were the most powerful in the world, just at over 8 megawatts each. The farm, this is also the farm people might remember Trump getting really annoyed about an offshore wind farm that would be seen from his golf course, and he tried to stop it, and that almost led at one point to Vattenfall selling out. Now Vattenfall, when they wanted to sell out in, I think it was 2013, they owned 3/4 of the wind farm. The remaining 25% was owned by Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group. And Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group is entirely owned by Aberdeen Council. And they played a central role in pushing for the wind farm to be developed. They were not instant selling out when Vattenfall wanted to jump ship. They were like, actually, no, this is going to happen. But then in 2016, they were like, oh, well, Vattenfall don't really want us to be part of this anymore. Vattenfall are owned by the Swedish state. They were like, and why don't they just do it? And we'll sell our 25% stake to Vattenfall. And they did. So now it's 100% owned by the Swedish state. That wasn't necessary. and it shows that actually, even an entity like Aberdeen City Council is able to take a developing role and could have stayed in there and reap the benefits. And particularly interesting, you know, as this is just from December, reaping the benefits of the massive prices and returning those benefits to local public, and using that, whether it's for retrofitting homes or bringing people's bills down in the immediate term. That would have been possible if they hadn't sold off that stake. So it's useful to look back to the past and go, well, actually, what could we have done differently there? It is still entirely possible to get in there. It's tempting to think, oh, we've missed a boat, especially given the scale of ScotWind and have all the leases that were rolled out there. And sometimes people go, oh, well, offshore wind's a mature industry and you'd never be able to catch up. BP only went into offshore wind in 2020. And they won significant leases in ScotWind. So, and you know, AREG was in there in 2013. ESB also, the Irish one, also only came in relatively recently. So a Scottish public owned end company still definitely has the capacity to move in there. You know, that could be by nationalizing, theoretically, by coming in and nationalizing existing resources. That would be challenging pre-independence. And another challenge currently is, of course, the Scottish government has a limit on how much it can borrow. And that gives a limitation to the scale of capital that it can put up. So one pathway of making it actually possible to go, well, we are going to set up a significant electricity generation company. And we're putting money on the table to that would be if the Scottish government works together with Scottish local authorities in terms of accessing the finance and then owning jointly to make that happen as a kind of practical, what can you do right now? Now, it might seem challenging to go, well, how would you have Scottish government owning it together with Scottish local authorities? How would you have different bodies part owning it and creating, how would they work together? How would they invest collectively? That's already happened in Germany. The Triano wind parks, both number 1 and number 2, were owned by, I think, 42 different municipal bodies, different municipalities. In Belgium, both Rental and Seamade offshore wind farms are being developed by a consortium that includes a range of different existing public energy companies, and one of them covers part of the south of Belgium, one of them covers part of the north. It's partly because of language issues that you've got a range of different Belgian energy companies, but they decided to come together and go, well, actually, offshore wind farms are quite big. It would be challenging for any one of us to develop these together, so we're going to do it collectively. If they can do it in Germany and in Belgium, then it would also be possible in Scotland. I've talked mostly about offshore wind. Obviously, public ownership doesn't need to be limited to that. It's tempting. Offshore wind is absolutely key because of the scale of potential within Scotland, especially what's already happening and what will happen. Onshore wind is also important. Solar is also very important in Scotland. Public ownership can include both the mega type of farms. It'd be hard to pull one off in Scotland on the same scale as what Sean just showed us in Mexico, but you can still have large ones, but also medium. In terms of rolling out solar across public buildings and rooftops, having that jointly done with whether it's a Scottish National and public energy company or regional municipal, that would make that much easier. As well as mature generation, doing new generations being developed like tidal stream wave and green hydrogen electrolysis, making sure that the benefits as that technology is developed and becomes something that really works, stays with the public, and also storage. And it will be key through that. Actually, public entities can have a lot more power and influence by developing to then make sure that actually those jobs along the way are created domestically, whether that's through investing directly into upgrading the ports and shipyards and manufacturing facilities, which Scotland really doesn't have at the moment. Right? Even to be fair to the private sector, even if they wanted to be manufacturing everything in Scotland right now, to the privately owned offshore wind developing companies, there isn't currently the capacity to do everything that needs to happen in Scotland, but there could be. Just depends upon upgrading it and making sure that those ports and manufacturing facilities are there. That's both about the investment. It's also about the procurement. Going, well, okay, let's procure domestically. Why should it be done elsewhere? Why should it be done in Spain or in the Emirates or the other side of the world? And here's a long list of other reasons why public generation would make a massive difference, whether it's about returning the revenues, the profits, if there's profits, to the public, limiting bills, reinvesting into communities, making sure that those jobs that are created and that those are also quality jobs, that are not below the minimum wage. So we've got the long-term planning for skill, accelerating climate transition, having an oversight of industrial strategy, developing that new technology at the pace we need to see it, being more self-sufficient, exporting, getting the public getting the benefits from the climate transition. All of that becomes so much more possible if we have public ownership of energy, and all of it becomes almost like, some of those different elements you can move towards by putting in some measures of regulation or accountability, and you can get somewhere. But actually getting that full just transition, rebuilding the manufacturing sector, sharing social benefits, and as Sean said, and as Rose said, actually getting to the climate targets we have to see, which ultimately we've got responsibility for the historic climate destruction that's happened for what's happening in the global south. We're going to need climate ownership of energy generation to get there. And I will stop there.